Top of the middle of the day to you boys and girls. We're at the bench in the shop in kind of a follow-up video, I guess, if you will. Some impressions in the initial stages of running these saws, and then some impressions after we've had a chance to spend some time using them. I guess we better just get down to brass tacks, throwing out the disclaimers. Obviously, we're at the bench. There won't be a whole lot of excitement. Knuckle/gearhead type material we're dealing with here, since I'm mostly knuckle, a little bit of gearhead type guy. Everything, I'm pulling all this information out of from the depths of my cranium, so I may slammer my speech a little bit. That's slur and or stammer. I made that up, that word anyway. So contact information is most likely going to be in the description area. So here you go. So a lot of scuttlebutt, if you will, between the 572 and 462. We have a 461. Never mind the 7900 Makita and the big bore 044 on the end. We're not talking about those two, only these three. Let's just throw the numbers out right off the bat because there's a lot of curiosity. Published information anyway, 14.5 pounds. I don't remember what the the kilograms was on that. It's got to be about 6.5 or something. 13.2 published information says it's 6 kilograms even. The 461 came in at 6.7. That's no fuel. I'm assuming with the 461, it's the half-wrap version and the little chicken wimpy dogs, if they even come with two. It's probably only one. Same with the 462, same with the 572. So, a lot of difference in weight. I was weighing this particular saw in a different fashion. I built the dogs on it. They're probably a little heavier. I had actually made the full wrap set of handlebars, a little bit heavier than stock. The 572 at that point weighed pretty close to the same as the 461. They came in about 1.5 pounds or whatever it was. I can't remember. It's been like months and months now. Ooh, coming up on a year. Well, 9 months ago. Regardless, it was a noticeable difference in weight. Okay, so the 462 is definitely lightweight. Physically, from tine to tip in the back of the tank, the 462 and 461 measure about 19.5 inches, so they're virtually the same. 572 comes in at about 19.75, I think it was. But again, I made the dogs, so a stock set of double dogs may end up altering that a little bit. Height-wise, they're relatively close to the same. We have an aftermarket maxi on the 461. It's a little taller in the back maybe than the stocker because it doesn't round off. I think it was about 9.5, 9 9.25. So relative height, same. Chainbrake handles are relatively the same height on the bench. Width-wise, I think it was about, well, let's just check and see real quick, shall we? Oh yeah, I got my tape right here. So you look down over the top, try to get it pretty decent from the very outside to very outside, maybe 7.25, 7.5. The 572 comes in at about 7.5 or so, and the 461 comes in at about 7.5 or so. So physically, they're not that much different in size. So I tried these saws with the 28. I've never tried one on a 461. That's a total waste of time. Well, from my perspective anyway. Mostly because you can't reach much with those. And 28-inch bars only measure 27. There's a 5-inch gap between a 32 if you measure it like you would normally measure a bar, end of the bar groove to the end of the tip, versus a 28, they're actually measuring 27 inches. So I didn't particularly care to run a bigger size, medium size, bigger medium size saw with that short of a bar, personally. But out on the West Coast, the ground's a little different than some places, and I don't know, just kind of maybe used to it. So anyway, I tried the 462 and the 572 out a lot with some 32s, some 33s, and even like 36 a little bit. I did not like the 462 with even the 33 in comparison to the 572. I like it with a 32, and I actually kind of conjured up a 30-inch lightweight, and that is the meal ticket right there. So that's, from my perspective, using them both out on the West Coast in some real-world application. I like the 572 with the 33 quite a bit. It's a little heavier, obviously, and it balances out a little bit better. I like them to be a little nose heavy. I don't like them to be power head heavy personally. That's just my preference, though. So there's some things that we've discussed. Displacement-wise, this actually is a really small engine. It is smaller than an 044 or the old version 372, 371 XPs. It comes in at 70.57 cc's. The other two that we're just talking about, they come in at 70.7. So this particular saw, interesting engine design. We've kind of discussed that a little bit. 72.20, and the 461 comes in at 76.45, I believe it is. So if we use the concept of a standard bore and stroke relationship in chainsaw engines, the 36 millimeter stroke is used in a lot of different saws and a few different bore sizes. 372s have a 36 millimeter stroke, and so does the 460, 461, 044, XPW. There's a lot of saws that have that, well, with those two manufacturers. Anyway, there's a number of saws that have that 36 millimeter stroke. So if you look at that perspective, and we transfer that into these two, it's completely different in the 572. It comes in at 39 millimeters. That's how long the stroke is in this saw. So way under square bore, if you want to talk about it like that, or an under square bore, maybe not way, but this particular saw comes in with a 34 millimeter stroke. That'd be the 462. That would be an over square engine design, if you will, more of a high winder. This would be more of a torque kind of an application. Like I said, I prefer this saw with a longer bar because of the torque factor from the longer stroke. I like this saw with a little bit shorter bar, and if you're out in a brush hole and steep gnarly yard or ground or something like that, you might end up running the longer bar on this just to, like, it's not going to wear you out as much, obviously. Probably not going to get as many off the stump, but there's always trade-offs in this life. So 48 millimeter bore, like we talked about, engine designs, that would be kind of an under square engine design concept, a really pretty long stroke in saws, considering the 090 only has a 40 millimeter stroke. This one's 39, versus 34 millimeters versus 36 millimeters. So if you look at the bore sizes, again, we talked about a 48. This is a 52. So it's a huge difference, 4 millimeters to be exact, in the size of the bore. I thought that was kind of noteworthy. We have a 52 millimeter bore as well in the 461, but again, it's quite a bit up displacement-wise. Now, I ran both of these saws in bone stock form against a 461. It wasn't this particular one. Everything's bone stock. About the same amount of runtime, not much. And they all three ran about the same times. I didn't have these two at the same exact time, but 32-inch bar, same bar and chain. The videos are in the collection somewhere. These ran the same as a stock 461. So once we start putting the herd on the bench, operating on them, if you will, it's no contest. The 461 just mops them up. 4 seconds, a lot of times, and I've seen it run without the carburation being completely dialed in, just mopping these two up. So, and there's some reasons why. I think there's some misconceptions out there that these saws have a lot of torque. I disagree. I think they have a lot of horsepower, actually. I think the rating for the 572 is like 5.7. I think that's the printed number. It comes in at 6.0 on the 462. It comes in at 6.0 on the 461. So, relatively close to the same amount of power. I've run these two, like I said, in stock form against one of these in stock form. They're all lazy, as far as I can tell. These run a little bit differently. However, if we consider what's going on with these engines, they are a quote-unquote stratification design engine, which means they're using a barrier of fresh air in between basically the way the piston's design is, and we actually have one handy. This is out of a X-Torque, but they're same concept in design. Fresh air goes in through the ports, and it gets stuffed back into the start of the transfer port, well, the actually end of the transfer port circuit. And that barrier actually goes into the transfer ports a little bit, and it delays the time that it takes for the fresh air charge to get out on top of the piston once the piston's going down and pressurizing the crankcase. So it's delaying how quick by just a fraction of the time, obviously, because when we're talking engines that are spinning 12 to 13,000, it's not much time we're talking about. And you're actually getting an introduction of raw air into the system. Now, we all know what happens when you get a seal leak in the standard old style engines. That saw comes alive, goes nuts, runs out of control good, kind of, but they don't last. So air leaks are not good in the old style saws. The new style saws come out of the box from the factory with a metered air leak. So it's like conceptually you have a torch handle body in your hand, you hit the handle on the back that introduces oxygen into the system. All of a sudden, now you're going to actually start cutting something with the torch. It's exactly the same concept. We're adding raw air into the system, making these saws run characteristically differently than they would normally. So out of the box, they run kind of wild because they basically are dealing with an air leak. And it's metered. It's a very small amount, but it's still an air leak. So, I harp about mix oil. With the design of the new engines, they have a sloppy tolerance out of the box. You better be using a super awesome mix oil. There's only a couple out there, from what I can tell of the research that I've done, that are gonna work well in these new smog saws that are running hot because you're adding fresh air into the circuit, and they have a sloppy tolerance. So mix oil choice is critical. Now, back on the concept of torque, let's go back for just a second. So if we talk about flywheel weights for a second, I actually have some. We're going to have to pause the video, though, because the 572 is very clean, and the 462 is not, and we have a couple of choices in the 460, 461. But let's just take a quick look at what we have going on with the saws. You can see if we're looking at them here, they're not much different in size. So that's just kind of the point I was trying to make. A little bit of weight difference. So if we look over at the scale, we can see that it's on. This is a 572 dual magnet system. It's monitoring the speed of the crank. That's how it's knowing how to meter, the controller's knowing how to meter the fuel. So if we check it out, clean, nice shape, 268. We're going to have to pause this, like I said, because I'm going to have to clean this up, get an accurate number. But this is the way it came out of the saw. weighs 304. So it's a little bit heavier. And this is a brand new 461 Flywheel 356. So quite a bit heavier. Keep in mind that 28 grams equals 1 ounce. 454 grams equal 1 pound. So they're relatively the same, 460 and 461. Okay, so let's pause. Let me clean up that flywheel. Then we'll kind of get into discussion of like the differential between horsepower and torque and why I think these saws don't necessarily have a lot of torque, but they do pretty good in the horsepower arena, if you will, mostly as a result and a benefit from the metered air leak that they have. So we'll take a brief intermission. Guy can hit the fridge, whatever. All right, so we had an opportunity to clean up the flywheel on our little intermission break for the 462. We're going to check it out on the scales. 298, re-verifying the 572, 287. So they're what, 11 grams different, so like a little more than a third of an ounce. So if we look at the 461, we see it comes in at 354, 355, so a couple of ounces heavier, something like that. If we look, I just happen to have a Poly 660 on hand underneath the bench that I grabbed out of there, so it's about 100 grams heavier. So 3.5 ounces or something like that relative. So we're seeing some weight differences, but they're not huge amounts. Now, if we want to talk about me trying to make the case for why I'm saying, and let's review what we're actually talking about. There we go. Why these two new kids on the block don't necessarily have a lot of torque from my angle anyway. The guy that was working across from me in about 87 or whatever that was, it could have been 88. Anyway, he was prototype testing what was going to become the 066. There was no designation at that point. Anybody that ran those early version saws, they remember about that big old Mondo heavy-duty aluminum flywheel, but they also had the 10 mil cranks, which those had a problem with breaking. But anyway, those saws ran different from when they changed over to the poly flywheel in later versions. So reciprocating mass is kind of part of the concept of having an engine that runs a certain way. You can verify that with different weights of flywheels. Horsepower is, I think by definition, 550 foot-pounds of work done in 1 second. I think that's what it is. Watts, it's like 750, 745 or something like that. So there's a few different ways that horsepower nowadays is defined, a little different than it was early on, hopefully for the better. But torque is a twisting or a torsional action. So the engine runs and it spins the drive line in your car, and the force that it exerts in the spinning motion on the drive line is a torque aspect. That's the same concept with the chain running around the guide bar in a chainsaw. And so a guy has to consider parasitic drag in the process. And the longer the bar, the more parasitic drag there is. A little shorty 16-inch bar robs about a half of a horsepower. I've seen it on a dyno. So with that in mind, the longer the bar, the more power that is robbed from the operation. I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. So it's a consideration if you're going to do a build. And I don't run stock saws much personally. I won't take a stock saw off the landing. They cut like a nosebleed. I won't do it. It's like I just won't do it. And so I don't spend a lot of time running saws in stock form. So I guess when I'm talking about, what I think about the concept, I think about it after they've actually been taken to a place where they run. And so I think I mentioned in the other session, all three of them are pretty lazy in stock form from what I can tell, even though these two run like a little bit more quote unquote on the pipe because of the raw air that's getting into the system. They still kind of are lagging. They're still kind of lagging. Again, the air leak saws run differently. If we had an air leak in a 461 and we could control it like in these two, this thing would stomp all over these saws if it came out of the box like that. But it doesn't, and they all run about the same in stock form, relatively close, with the same bar and chain that I tried myself. So after running them a little bit in stock form, I kind of changed some things, and the 461 leaves them in the dust. It's 4 or 5 seconds. I had to do a lot of tweaking on the 461 in addition to an alternate air cleaner system to get it to flow well enough with the dual ported exhaust, I might add. This has a single ported exhaust to get it to run finally at about in the same ballpark. I ran these two again with actually a bigger air cleaner on it, and against the 660, and the 660 and this saw were pretty close to the same. The 660 might have been a little bit faster, but this one was about a second behind. Again, same bar and chain on all three. So this saw is about as far as you can go. This saw has another level that you can take it to. So I try to get them equal in that aspect, same amount of work. We talked about the weight. If a guy was going to buy one of these, I think that patronizing whichever shop is important, that would be something I would consider. The spare parts that I have laying around would be another thing that I would consider. The bar mounts that I have like a full complement in any kind of a certain bar mount. It's not like what we're dealing with is a Lamborghini and a VW. We're dealing with comparable machinery. You're not going to go over to one shop and get a Ferrari and because you're driving a VW now. That's not how it works. I'm also not the type of person that goes, because it says Husqvarna on it, it is the most awesome thing that ever was. Or at the same time, it says Stihl on it, so now that's just the most awesome thing that ever happened since sliced bread. I have owned saws, all kinds of saws myself personally. I've ran all kinds of saws over the years. My first quote-unquote real saw that was mine was an 045. I've had 181s, 281s, 064s, 084s, 3120s, 2100s, 394s, 395s, 372s. I think you're getting a picture. 046s, 660s. I'm thinking you're kind of tracking. I've ran a lot of different saws over the years. I've actually worn out quite a few saws over the years. I don't necessarily have a preference. I think in some applications, some saws work better than others because of the inherent way they feel, what they are, how they run. There's something about them that causes them to be a little different in some applications. So overall impressions, the pistol grip on the Husky saws is kind of sweet, the way they have this comfort feature right here. It's kind of a squishy rubber thing. The pistol grip's actually a little bit bigger in size and a different shape than what we see on most of the Stihls. I have a little bit smaller hands. I prefer the Stihl, actually. The best one on the market that I know of is the 64 to 7900 Makita / Dolmars. It's all the same design, but that pistol grip has got a different shape, fits your hand much better. The 084's got a really nice pistol grip. But back on track, I like the fact that the off is down on the Husqvarna a lot. We've talked about some other applications, fit and finish. They're relatively close to the same. I wouldn't cry if I had either one of them to use. I just think there's different applications for the two. We kind of talked about bars and links, and I don't know, they're still kind of in this unavailable stage. They're just now kind of hitting stores retail. I think this one's going to be about $1,000 to $1,100, somewhere in there, $1,050 to $1,100 with the 32, but I'm sure that's the heavyweight bar. I'm not exactly positive. These are still hiding out in the warehouse from what I can tell, but they're in the warehouse, so that's sweet. Pick a color, I guess. That would be my suggestion. Okay, so we've been getting some interruptions, so just kind of the way things go sometimes. Going to have to splice some of this together. I've been rambling on and on about these two saws. If you're going to buy something new and like picking a dealer based on who you want to spend your money with, that kind of a concept. I've kind of talked about in a video where I blew the chain and wrecked the little pin that sticks down. It's cast into the side cover, and I can't run a dust flap in there anymore. So again, there's such a thing as too lightweight. I did harp on the local Husqvarna dealer for years and years and years about more power and less weight, but then there's a point where it can be too less of weight. I know that this saw with a 32, while its island has a hard time staying on the log because the power head's so light. If you do all this, you can actually get a better running saw with less work from the old school stuff, 461. But if we're talking about the new kids on the block, fit and finish seems to be nice in both of them. I talked about miscellaneous other things, I guess, in certain videos. Tree service application, if you're going to be in a tree like a monkey, this might be kind of a good choice. You can still get the thing to run a 32 pretty good. It's quite a bit less weight than this saw. Going to run a long bar, a little bit longer bar, not a long bar, but a little bit longer bar. Maybe this saw. There's pros and cons to everything. I can't actually just go, a guy should just buy this because this one's no good. Personally, I can't actually do that. I can't. There's good and bad in every saw that I've ever ran, and so finding what's good in the saw and using it in the application is what I always try to do. That's why I had many different saws over the years in many different applications. So takes a lot of work to get this thing to run really good. From my perspective anyway, doesn't take quite as much in the old stuff, weighs quite a bit more. Yeah, if I was running these all the time every day, which is what it's coming to, you better have a really awesome mix oil, and that's kind of a can of worms in and of itself. But if you kind of look at the numbers, the data, and then actually run the oils, you can get a pretty good idea, which I've actually done a lot of that myself personally. These saws require a little bit more attention to detail in that department because, again, we're introducing raw air into the system, causing them to run hot. So I wish I could go, yeah, buy this one, or yeah, buy this one. If you want just all-out stumping power and you're going to run a 32 to a 36, it's that one, actually. That's what I'd be doing if I wanted to get them off the stump and it wasn't a super awesome, nasty, steep yarder ground full of brush. I'd be running that one. I might even be running that one anyway. It just depends on like what's going on. I wish I had a more definitive response, but until you actually get one in your hands and feel it and maybe test drive it a little bit, the guy's never going to know. So that's my take. Anyway, thanks for watching this session. Have a blessed day wherever you might be on God's green earth.